"Help me. I can't breathe," she cried. But when Vampire King lifted the cloth, he turned pale. "Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much." The rain came down relentlessly, the sky above dark and unforgiving. Sarah stumbled through the alley, gasping for air as each breath felt like it was being stolen from her chest. Her heart pounded in her ears, and the world around her seemed to blur. She had no idea how she had ended up here, or why they were chasing her. All she knew was that she had to keep running. The sharp click of heels echoed behind her, followed by the sound of someone yelling her name. She turned, but her vision was too clouded with panic. A man, his face twisted with anger, lunged toward her, grabbing her arm. "You can't escape, Sarah," he sneered. His grip tightened, cutting off her air supply. Her vision blurred, and her legs buckled beneath her, but she fought against the blackness threatening to claim her. Just when she thought she couldn't go any further, a strong, commanding voice called out from the darkness. "Release her," it demanded. The man holding Sarah froze, his expression changing from one of anger to confusion. From the shadows, a figure emerged, tall, regal, with an air of power that seemed to fill the alley. The man's grip on Sarah loosened, and she collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The figure stepped closer, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. He knelt beside her, his hand brushing her hair back as he examined her fragile form. His pale skin seemed to glow in the moonlight, and there was an unsettling calm about him. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. Sarah could barely muster the strength to respond, her body trembling from the ordeal. She nodded weakly, her breath still ragged. The man, no, the vampire, lifted his hand, and his eyes narrowed. "You're fortunate I arrived when I did," he said, his voice filled with an icy calm. "If I hadn't, you would have been dead by now." Sarah blinked, still struggling to comprehend what was happening. Was this some kind of sick joke? Or had she really just been saved by a vampire? Her mind raced, but before she could say anything, the vampire gently lifted the cloth covering her face. And that was when he froze. His eyes widened, and his normally pale face turned even paler. It was as though he had seen a ghost. The air around them seemed to shift, and a heavy silence fell over the alley. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. What was happening? Why did he look so shocked? The vampire's gaze remained fixed on her face, his expression unreadable. She felt a cold chill run through her as his fingers brushed against her cheek, as though he was searching for something. "No," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "It can't be you." Sarah's pulse quickened, and she instinctively pulled away from his touch. "What do you mean?" she gasped, her voice trembling. The vampire didn't answer right away. He stood, pacing back and forth in the alley as he muttered to himself. Sarah's mind raced, but she could hardly make sense of it all. Who was this man? And why did he seem so afraid? His voice broke the silence, sharp and commanding. "You have no idea what you've just walked into, do you?" The vampire's gaze remained locked on Sarah, his eyes widening in disbelief, still fixated on her face. She felt the coldness of his stare, like a sharp blade cutting through her skin. "It can't be you," he repeated, as though his words held some kind of forbidden meaning. Sarah could barely comprehend what was happening. "What do you mean? What's going on?" she asked, her voice shaky, her heart pounding in her chest. The vampire seemed to snap out of his trance and straightened, his eyes hardening, but there was still an unspoken fear hidden behind his regal composure. He took a step back and motioned for Sarah to stand. She hesitated for a moment before pushing herself up onto shaky legs, still feeling the sting of the ordeal she had just escaped. "You're not safe here," he said, his tone calm, yet filled with urgency. Sarah glanced around, trying to piece together the situation. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The vampire took another step back, turning his head slightly as if trying to distance himself from something that had just become too overwhelming. "I am the Vampire King," he said slowly, as though the words held weight beyond their literal meaning. "And I believe you are the one who can break the curse that binds me." Sarah froze, her mind racing with 100 different thoughts. Was this some kind of nightmare? Was he really a vampire? And what curse was he talking about? She opened her mouth to speak, but the vampire held up a hand, silencing her before she could ask any more questions. I will explain everything, he said, his voice steady, but we need to leave now. His eyes darted toward the alleyway behind them, where shadows moved and flickered in the dim light. There are those who would do anything to stop you from learning the truth. Sarah looked at him, her confusion growing deeper. Why me, she asked. Why would I be the one to help you? The Vampire King paused, his gaze softening just slightly. Because you are connected to me in ways you cannot yet understand. I have waited centuries for someone like you. Someone who could break the chains that hold me prisoner. I'm just a regular woman, Sarah said, shaking her head in disbelief. I don't even know who you are. The vampire's lips tightened into a thin line, his expression hardening again. You may not understand now, but you will, he said, his voice low. And you will learn the truth soon enough. He turned, walking toward the end of the alley. Sarah hesitated, torn between staying in this strange, terrifying place or following this man who seemed to hold the answers to questions she hadn't even thought to ask. Finally, she took a deep breath and walked toward him, determined to find out what was really happening. Where are we going? She asked, still unsure whether she could trust him. You'll see, the Vampire King replied, his eyes glinting with something unreadable. As they walked through the winding streets, Sarah's mind raced. The further they went, the more she realized that she wasn't just in a nightmare. This was real, and somehow, she was tangled up in a story much larger than she had ever imagined. The Vampire King led her to an old, towering mansion at the edge of the city. Its stone walls loomed over her, and an eerie quiet settled in the air. Sarah could feel the weight of the place pressing in on her, as if the mansion itself was alive with centuries of history. The Vampire King turned to her and stopped at the grand entrance. This is where it all began, he said, his voice quieter now. And it is where you must choose your path. Sarah looked up at the door, then back at him. What do you mean? She asked, her heart racing again. He paused before replying. This is the place where the curse began, where the magic that binds me was first cast. And this is where you must decide if you are willing to take the risk. There are forces here that would rather see me remain imprisoned forever. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had no idea what he was talking about, but the urgency in his voice left her with no choice but to follow him inside. As the door creaked open, she stepped into the darkness of the mansion, the air thick with dust and ancient secrets. The Vampire King led her down a long corridor, past rooms filled with old tapestries and forgotten relics. Finally, they reached a massive chamber, its stone walls lined with shelves of books and scrolls. The air was heavy with magic. This is where the answers lie, he said, motioning toward the shelves. But it's also where the danger is greatest. Sarah's heart pounded as she stepped into the room, the weight of what she was about to learn pressing down on her shoulders. She had no idea what she was walking into, but one thing was certain. Her life was about to change forever. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered, more to herself than to him. The Vampire King turned, his eyes dark with something close to sorrow. You already have, he said, his voice soft. The moment you touched me, you sealed your fate. The room was suffocating. The heavy scent of ancient dust mingled with the cold air, and the only sound was the Vampire King's steady breathing. Sarah felt her heart hammering in her chest as she stood in the middle of the chamber, surrounded by shelves filled with centuries-old books and scrolls. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into a world that wasn't meant for her, one that had been hidden away for generations. The Vampire King's eyes glinted in the dim light as he stepped closer, his movements fluid and precise. You felt it, haven't you? He asked, his voice low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. Sarah blinked, confused. Felt what? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The Vampire King didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned, his fingers brushing against the spine of an old leather-bound book. The connection, he said finally. The bond between us. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? There's no connection between us. She took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to run, to get away from this strange, dangerous place. But the Vampire King's gaze held her in place. Oh, but there is, he said softly. The moment you touched me, You sealed your fate. You've already begun to unravel the curse that binds me. Sarah shook her head, trying to make sense of his words. This is insane. I don't even know you. I don't understand any of this. The Vampire King's expression softened for the briefest moment, but it was gone almost as soon as it appeared. He motioned for her to come closer. I know this is overwhelming, he said, but you need to understand something. You are the key to breaking the curse that has kept me bound for centuries. Without you, I am trapped. Sarah stared at him, her confusion growing. Why me? Why would I be the one to help you? The Vampire King's eyes darkened. Because you are the descendant of the witch who cursed me, he said, his voice heavy with history. Your blood carries the magic that can undo what was done long ago. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She took a step back, her legs suddenly feeling like they were made of jelly. You're saying I'm related to the witch who cursed you? That's impossible. The Vampire King nodded, his gaze unwavering. It's not impossible. It's the truth. Your bloodline is tied to the magic that binds me, and only you can break it. Sarah's mind reeled. She had no idea what to make of his words, but a part of her couldn't deny the strange pull she felt toward him, the sense that there was something deeper, something ancient, that she couldn't understand. I don't know if I can do this, she said, her voice shaking. The Vampire King took a step forward, his eyes softening. You don't have a choice, he said gently. You've already chosen. You just don't realize it yet. Sarah opened her mouth to protest. But before she could say anything, the Vampire King reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek in a surprisingly tender gesture. You have the power to change everything, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But the question is, will you? Sarah looked up at him, her heart racing in her chest. She had no idea what she was getting herself into, but something deep inside her knew that this was the beginning of something she couldn't escape. The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy cloak. She was caught in this world, whether she liked it or not. The Vampire King's gaze never left her face as he stepped back. We don't have much time, he said, his voice steady once again. The curse is weakening, and with it, the barriers between our worlds. Soon, others will come for you, and they won't stop until they have you. Sarah's stomach tightened with fear. Who are these people? What do they want with me? The Vampire King's expression hardened, and for a moment, she saw something dark in his eyes, something ancient, dangerous. They are the ones who placed the curse on me, he said, his voice cold. And they will stop at nothing to keep me bound, to keep you from unlocking the magic within you. Sarah could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her, the knowledge that she was now a part of something much larger than herself. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this, but one thing was clear, there was no turning back. The Vampire King turned, motioning for her to follow him. Come, he said, his voice low and commanding. The answers you seek lie ahead, but the road will be dangerous. Are you ready to face what comes next? Sarah hesitated, but only for a moment. There was something in his words, something in his presence, that made her feel as though she had no choice. She took a deep breath and followed him into the depths of the mansion, knowing that everything she thought she knew was about to change forever. The Vampire King led Sarah through the maze of corridors, his steps silent but sure as they echoed through the cold stone halls. The mansion seemed to stretch on forever, its grandeur overwhelming, and yet there was something ominous about it all. She couldn't shake the feeling that the walls themselves were watching her, listening to her every step. She glanced at the Vampire King, who was walking ahead of her, his posture rigid and his expression unreadable. Where are we going? Sarah asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and fear. The Vampire King didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed forward as if he were calculating every movement. You need to understand the gravity of what you've become part of, he said at last, his voice steady but tinged with something dark. This mansion, it's not just a home. It's the heart of the curse, the place where everything began and where it must end. Sarah's pulse quickened as she tried to make sense of his words. What do you mean? What does this curse have to do with me? She asked, the confusion making her feel more lost than ever. The Vampire King stopped in front of a large wooden door, carved with intricate symbols she didn't recognize. He turned to face her, his amber eyes piercing through the dim light. The curse that binds me, he began, was cast by a powerful group of sorcerers centuries ago. They used your ancestors' blood to trap me, to keep me from ever being free. But now, Now you are the only one who can undo what was done. Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. My ancestor? She whispered. I don't even know who she was. The Vampire King stepped closer, his presence overwhelming as he placed his hand on the door, pushing it open with ease. You will learn everything soon enough, he said, his voice cold and unwavering. As the door creaked open, Sarah stepped into the room behind him, her eyes widening as she took in the sight before her. The chamber was vast, filled with ancient books, scrolls, and relics, all covered in a thick layer of dust. The air felt heavier here, almost suffocating, as if the very atmosphere was steeped in dark magic. At the far end of the room, on a raised platform, stood an ornate altar. The stone surface was covered in ancient symbols, and the walls surrounding it were lined with shelves filled with artifacts that seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't quite understand. This is where the ritual will take place, the Vampire King said, his voice low and almost reverent. This is where you will face the truth and decide whether or not you are willing to take on the burden of breaking the curse. Sarah looked around the room, her heart racing. I don't know if I can do this, she admitted, her voice trembling. The weight of the situation was beginning to sink in. She had no idea what she was walking into, but the sense of inevitability was almost suffocating. You don't have a choice, the Vampire King said, his eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't quite place. Once you entered this world, there was no turning back. You are bound to me now, and we are bound to each other by fate. Sarah felt a chill run through her as the realization of what he was saying hit her. She was trapped, but not just in this mansion. She was trapped in a world that she had no understanding of, with a man, no, a vampire, who was tied to her in ways she couldn't fathom. What if I don't want to do this? She asked, the fear creeping into her voice. What if I can't break the curse? The Vampire King stepped closer, his eyes softening for a moment, though there was still a lingering darkness in his gaze. Then we will both remain trapped, he said simply. Forever. Sarah swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. But if I do this, what will happen to me? To us? The Vampire King's lips curled into a faint smile, though it held no warmth. That, my dear, is something you will discover soon enough, he said, turning away from her to approach the altar. He motioned for her to follow, and reluctantly, Sarah did. As she stepped closer to the altar, she felt the pull of the energy in the room intensify. It was like the room itself was alive, as if the very stones under her feet were calling out to her. The Vampire King reached out and touched the altar, tracing the symbols carved into its surface. This is where the magic will be channeled, he said. This is where your blood will merge with mine, and the curse will either be broken or sealed forever. Sarah's stomach twisted in fear. She had no idea what to expect, but she knew that the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. Are you ready? The Vampire King asked, his voice low and filled with a quiet intensity. Sarah took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had no choice but to follow through. She had no idea what the future held, but one thing was certain. This was only the beginning. I'm ready, she said, her voice barely a whisper. The Vampire King nodded, his gaze meeting hers. Then let the ritual begin. The air in the room grew heavier as Sarah stood before the altar, her mind swirling with uncertainty. The Vampire King stood beside her, his eyes focused on the ancient symbols etched into the stone. His presence seemed to fill the room, making it feel both suffocating and powerful at the same time. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had no idea what to expect, but she knew that whatever happened next would change her life forever. The Vampire King turned to her, his amber eyes locking with hers. Are you sure you're ready for this? He asked, his voice low but filled with an urgency that made her stomach tighten. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I don't know if I'm ready, she admitted, her voice trembling. But I don't think I have a choice. The Vampire King nodded, his expression softening for a brief moment. No, you don't, he said quietly. But you've come this far. There's no turning back now. Sarah looked down at the altar, where an ancient bowl sat, its surface gleaming in the dim light. The Vampire King motioned toward it. This is where the magic will flow, he explained. Your blood, your power, will merge with mine to break the curse that binds me. Sarah felt a cold shiver run down her spine at the thought. What if it doesn't work? she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The Vampire King's gaze softened. If it doesn't work, he said, his tone filled with a sadness she hadn't expected, we will both remain trapped. Forever. The reality of his words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had no idea what kind of magic they were dealing with, but she knew it was ancient and powerful. Her blood was somehow the key to breaking the curse, but that also meant that whatever happened, her fate was now tied to his. She glanced at the Vampire King, her heart racing. What happens to me after this? She asked. What if the curse is broken? He hesitated for a moment, his gaze flicking to the altar. If the curse is broken, then you'll be free, he said, his voice low and almost guarded. But that freedom comes with a price. The bond between us will be severed, and you will have to decide whether you want to stay or leave. Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach. She didn't know if she was ready to let go of the Vampire King, not when their connection felt so strong. But at the same time, she wasn't sure if she could continue to live in this world, filled with danger and uncertainty. The Vampire King stepped forward, his eyes glinting in the dim light. Place your hands on the altar, he instructed. The ritual can only begin once you commit to it fully. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped forward, her hands trembling as she placed them on the cool stone surface. The moment her skin made contact with the altar, a surge of energy shot through her body. It was as though 1,000 voices whispered in her ear, urging her to follow through with the ritual. Her heart raced, and she could feel the magic building inside her, rising like a tide that was about to break free. The Vampire King stepped beside her, his hand brushing against hers. He closed his eyes, as if concentrating on something deep within himself. This is it, he said, his voice strained. We're both in this together now. Sarah nodded, trying to steady her breathing. She could feel the weight of his words, the enormity of what they were about to do. The room seemed to darken as the magic swirled around them, pulling them both into a shared vision. In that moment, Sarah saw flashes of the past, the curse being cast, the bloodlines entwined, and the Vampire King bound by chains of magic that had lasted for centuries. She saw the faces of those who had cursed him, their eyes filled with hatred and fear. And then, she saw herself, her bloodline, the one that had been chosen to undo what had been done. She gasped, her hands tightening on the altar as the vision faded. The Vampire King's voice cut through the silence. It's happening, he said, his tone low and full of intensity. Hold on. Sarah could feel the power building inside her, the magic pulsing through her veins as she held onto the altar. The air grew thick with energy, and the walls of the room seemed to hum with power. It felt like the entire mansion was alive, breathing in sync with them. And then, with a sudden surge, the magic erupted. A blinding light enveloped them both, and Sarah's body jerked as if it had been struck by lightning. She gasped for air, her body trembling as the energy coursed through her. The Vampire King's grip tightened on her hand, but she could feel him faltering. The light grew brighter, and for a moment, Sarah couldn't see anything at all. Her entire world was consumed by the raw power of the magic. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The room was still. The air felt different, lighter, almost like a weight had been lifted from the mansion itself. Sarah opened her eyes, gasping as she looked around. The altar was now glowing faintly, and the Vampire King was standing beside her, his eyes wide with disbelief. It's done, he whispered, his voice hoarse. The curse is broken. Sarah felt a rush of relief wash over her, but there was also a deep sense of loss. She had done it. The curse had been broken, but she had no idea what would happen next. The bond between them had been severed, and Sarah wasn't sure where to go from here. She looked at the Vampire King, her heart heavy with emotion. What happens now? She asked softly. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. Now, we face whatever comes next, he said, his voice steady. Together, or apart, depending on what you choose. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stood motionless, her hand still resting on the altar, her heart racing as she tried to comprehend what had just happened. The blinding light had faded, leaving only a soft glow around the room. The heavy air of the mansion seemed to have lifted, and for the first time since she had entered this place, she felt a strange sense of calm. The Vampire King, still standing beside her, was looking at the altar, his face unreadable. His posture was tense, but there was a flicker of something almost like relief, deep within his amber eyes. Sarah shifted slightly, glancing at him. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He turned to her, his expression still hard, but his voice was softer than before. "Yes," he said, his words heavy with finality. "The curse is broken. The magic that bound me is gone." Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. It was hard to grasp that it was over, that the power that had controlled his life for centuries had finally been undone. But even as the weight of the victory began to settle in, something else lingered in the air, a sense of uncertainty, of something yet to come. She stepped away from the altar, looking around the room, trying to make sense of it all. The mansion was still as grand as it had been before, but it felt different now. The oppressive weight of the curse that had hung over it seemed to have lifted, but there was an emptiness now. The Vampire King followed her, his footsteps echoing softly in the now quiet room. "The curse may be broken," he said, his voice low, "but that does not mean the danger is over." Sarah turned to face him, confusion written on her face. "What do you mean? I thought breaking the curse was the key to everything." The Vampire King's eyes darkened, and his jaw tightened. "It was the key to freeing me, yes," he said. "But there are others who will stop at nothing to see me return to the chains that held me." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "You mean there are still people who want to control you?" The Vampire King nodded grimly. "The ones who cursed me are long gone, but their legacy lives on. There are still forces, powerful and dangerous, who seek to take control of the magic that has now been freed. They will come for you, for both of us." Sarah's heart pounded as the weight of his words sank in. She hadn't expected this. She thought that once the curse was broken, things would settle down. She had imagined that she would be free to live a normal life, free to leave this dark world behind. But now, it seemed like their troubles were far from over. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. The Vampire King's eyes softened, just for a moment, but the coldness quickly returned. "We fight," he said simply, "and we prepare. You have a role to play in this, Sarah. Whether you accept it or not, your blood is part of the magic that has been unleashed. You are as much a part of this as I am." She shook her head, feeling overwhelmed. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask to be part of your curse, to be dragged into your world." The Vampire King took a step toward her, his expression unreadable. "You didn't ask for this, but you are here," he said quietly. "And now, you must decide if you will stand with me, or if you will walk away." Sarah looked at him, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She didn't know what to do, didn't know if she was strong enough to face whatever was coming next. But she also knew one thing. She couldn't turn her back on this now. She had seen the truth of the magic, felt the connection between them, and she couldn't walk away from it. She had made a choice, whether she realized it or not. "I'll stay," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. "But I need to know what I'm fighting for. I need to know what's at stake." The Vampire King studied her for a moment, his gaze intense, as if searching for something deep within her. Finally, he nodded. "The stakes are high," he said. "If we fail, the magic that binds us will be used to control more than just me. It will fall into the hands of those who wish to wield it for their own purposes. And that will bring about destruction unlike anything this world has ever seen." Sarah swallowed hard. The weight of his words hit her like a punch to the gut. She didn't fully understand the power they were dealing with, but she knew enough to realize that the consequences of failure would be catastrophic. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The Vampire King reached into his coat and pulled out a small vial of dark liquid. He held it up, letting the faint light from the room reflect off its surface. "This is the key," he said, his voice low. "It's the final piece of the puzzle. With it, we can ensure that the magic is sealed away forever, before anyone else can claim it." Sarah looked at the vial, her mind racing. "What do we have to do with it?" she asked. The Vampire King's gaze met hers, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "We need to make the final sacrifice," he said. "And that sacrifice will require both of us." The weight of the decision pressed down on Sarah as she stood beside the Vampire King, staring at the small vial in his hand. The dark liquid inside seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and she could feel the magic surrounding it, swirling in the air like a storm waiting to break. Her heart raced as she tried to grasp the gravity of what was about to happen. "What do you mean by sacrifice?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. The Vampire King's eyes darkened, his face hardening. The magic that binds us is ancient, he explained, his voice low and steady. To ensure it is sealed away forever, we must offer something of ourselves, something vital. The ritual requires both of us to give up something precious, something that will create a permanent bond and prevent anyone from ever using the magic again. Sarah felt her stomach twist with anxiety. You're asking me to give up something, my life? The Vampire King shook his head, his gaze softer than before. No, not your life. But a part of you, something you cannot get back. The sacrifice will bind us in a way that ensures the magic remains sealed, but it will also change us both. It's the only way. Sarah's mind spun as she processed his words. What could she possibly sacrifice that would make this ritual work? And what would she be left with once it was over? The thought of losing a part of herself, the part that was connected to her, humanity, was terrifying. And what about you? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What do you have to give? The Vampire King didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the vial in his hand, his expression unreadable. I will give up my immortality, he said, his voice heavy with finality. The magic that has kept me alive for centuries will be undone. I will no longer be the Vampire King, and I will no longer possess the power that has defined me for so long. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she tried to imagine what that meant for him. To give up immortality, to give up the very thing that had made him a ruler of an entire race of vampires. It was a sacrifice beyond anything she could fathom. She looked at him, her heart heavy with both sympathy and fear. And what will we be left with after the sacrifice? She asked quietly. The Vampire King met her gaze, his amber eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. We will be free, he said simply. Free from the curse, free from the magic, free from the chains that have bound me for so long. But freedom comes with a price. It will change everything. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to understand what that meant. Could she really give up a part of herself to ensure that the curse was broken? And could she trust the Vampire King to keep his word, to protect her once the ritual was completed? Are you sure you're ready for this? She asked, her voice small. Once we do this, there's no going back. The Vampire King nodded, his face serious. I've been alive for centuries, Sarah, he said. I've seen everything, done everything, and yet I've never been free. This is my only chance. And you are my only hope. Sarah took a deep breath, her mind still reeling from everything that had happened. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew one thing. This was the only way to ensure that they were both free. The weight of the decision still felt crushing, but a part of her understood that there was no other choice. She had already sacrificed so much just by being here, just by accepting the Vampire King's presence in her life. Giving up something of herself now was the final step. I'm ready, she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her heart. The Vampire King's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, she saw something in his eyes, something human, something vulnerable. You don't have to do this, he said quietly, but I will be forever grateful if you do. She nodded, her resolve firm. We do this together, she said, her voice strong. Together, he echoed, and for the first time since they had met, Sarah saw a flicker of something like hope in his eyes. The Vampire King stepped forward, his hand reaching out to hers. She took it, her fingers trembling as they intertwined. In that moment, she knew that this was the right choice. The bond between them was undeniable, and they were both connected to the magic in ways they couldn't fully understand. But this sacrifice, this final step, would change everything. As they stood there, side by side, the ritual began. The air in the room thickened as the magic swirled around them, and Sarah could feel the power of it coursing through her veins. The vial of dark liquid began to glow, and she knew that the moment had come. The Vampire King's voice was low and steady as he spoke the incantation, his words ancient and full of power. As the magic reached its peak, Sarah felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if something deep inside her was being torn away. She gasped, her body trembling, but she held on to the Vampire King's hand, refusing to let go. The pain intensified, but then, just as quickly as it had come, it was gone. The room fell silent, and Sarah felt a profound shift within herself. The magic had been sealed, the curse broken, and they were both free. But as she looked at the Vampire King, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Their lives had changed in ways they couldn't yet understand, and the future was uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. They had survived, and now, they would face whatever came next, together. The silence after the ritual was deafening. Sarah stood there, still gripping the Vampire King's hand, her breath slow and measured as the weight of what had just transpired settled around her. The energy in the room had shifted, leaving behind an eerie calm that made her skin prickle. The curse was broken. The magic had been sealed away. And yet, despite the success of the ritual, Sarah felt the uncertainty still hanging in the air like an unspoken question. She looked at the Vampire King, whose gaze was fixed on the altar where the dark liquid had once been. His expression was unreadable, but she could sense the weight of centuries of burdens being lifted from his shoulders. But that weight was replaced by something else. Something new. "It's over," Sarah whispered, more to herself than to him. "The curse is broken." The Vampire King nodded, but there was no joy in his expression. "Yes," he said, his voice soft yet laden with something unspoken. "But the danger is far from over. We've only sealed the magic. The world will notice, and those who seek to control it will come after us." Sarah's stomach twisted at his words. She had hoped that breaking the curse would mean freedom, but instead, it seemed to mark the beginning of something even darker. "What now?" she asked, her voice trembling with uncertainty. The Vampire King turned to face her, his amber eyes locking onto hers. For the first time since they met, his gaze softened, and she saw the vulnerability that had always been hidden beneath his hardened exterior. "Now, we prepare," he said quietly. "We cannot stay here. There are too many forces at work in this world, forces that will stop at nothing to claim what we've just sealed away. We need to leave." Sarah swallowed hard. She didn't want to leave. She had just begun to understand this world, this place that had somehow become her own. But the urgency in his voice, the fear in his eyes, told her that there was no choice. "Where will we go?" she asked, her heart racing. The Vampire King stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "We go to the sanctuary," he said, "a place where no one can reach us. It's hidden, protected by old magic. Only those who know the way can find it." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. The idea of running, of fleeing from danger, was terrifying. But she knew deep down that staying in one place wouldn't protect them from what was coming. The Vampire King held out his hand to her, his fingers brushing against hers. "I'll keep you safe," he promised, his voice almost a whisper. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her mind racing with doubt. She had trusted him before, and it had led her here, to this point where everything had changed. She didn't know what the future would hold, but in that moment, she knew that her life was forever tied to his. She took a deep breath and nodded, placing her hand in his. "Let's go," she said softly. Together, they turned toward the door, the heavy silence of the mansion behind them. As they stepped out into the night, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that unseen eyes were upon them. But she pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on the Vampire King's steady grip on her hand, the warmth that seemed to radiate from his touch. They walked through the dark streets, the moon casting long shadows over the path before them. Sarah had no idea where they were going, but the Vampire King moved with a purpose, his every step sure and deliberate. She followed, trusting him more than she had trusted anyone in her life. After what felt like hours, they reached the edge of the city, where the tall buildings gave way to open fields and dark forests. The Vampire King stopped at the edge of the forest, his gaze scanning the surrounding area. "We're close," he said, his voice low. "The sanctuary is just beyond these woods." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and unease. The darkness of the forest seemed to stretch on forever, its dense trees hiding whatever lay beyond. But the Vampire King's confidence gave her hope, even if she was scared. "How will we know when we've found it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Vampire King glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You'll know," he said simply. "The magic will reveal it to you when the time comes." With that, he led her into the forest, the sounds of the city fading behind them. The air grew colder as they moved deeper into the woods, the trees closing in around them. Sarah could barely make out the path before them, but she trusted the Vampire King's instincts. They walked in silence for what felt like an eternity, the only sound their footsteps on the damp earth. And then, as if from nowhere, the forest opened up into a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an old stone structure, covered in ivy and moss. It looked ancient, as though it had been there for centuries. The air around it hummed with power, and Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. The Vampire King stopped, turning to her with a look of both relief and resolve. "We've arrived," he said, his voice steady. "This is the sanctuary." Sarah stared at the structure, feeling a sense of awe and fear. It was beautiful, in a way, but also foreboding, as though it held secrets that could never be unlocked. The Vampire King stepped forward, leading her toward the entrance. "Come," he said softly. "Inside, you will be safe." But even as he spoke the words, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence around them felt too heavy, too oppressive. She took a step forward, her heart pounding, and entered the sanctuary. And as she crossed the threshold, she felt the magic shift once again, and the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening finality. The door slammed shut behind them with a force that made Sarah jump, the sound echoing through the sanctuary's stone walls like a warning. She turned quickly to look at it, but the door was already fading into the shadows, as if it had never been there at all. The silence that followed felt unnerving, a quiet so deep it pressed in on her from all sides. She glanced at the Vampire King, but he was already moving deeper into the sanctuary, his face set in a grim expression. He had not reacted to the door closing, as if it were something he expected. "Is this normal?" Sarah asked, her voice echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. The Vampire King didn't look back at her, but his voice came low and steady. "Yes," he said, "this place is designed to protect us. But it's also a prison, in a way. Once you enter, you cannot leave unless you're called. This place is sealed by ancient magic." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "A prison?" she repeated, trying to understand. "Why would we need to be protected if we're safe from the curse?" The Vampire King paused, his back still turned to her. "There are others," he said simply. "Others who will stop at nothing to claim the magic we've just sealed. We are not safe, even here." Sarah's stomach twisted with anxiety. She had hoped that this sanctuary would be a place of peace, where they could finally breathe, but it seemed that the danger was far from over. The weight of everything that had happened, the curse, the ritual, the blood they had shared, pressed down on her like a storm she could not outrun. "What do we do now?" she asked, stepping closer to him. He turned slightly, enough for her to see the intensity in his amber eyes. "Now," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "we prepare. We don't have much time. The forces that seek the magic we've sealed away are already on the move." Sarah's mind raced. The uncertainty was suffocating. The idea that there were other forces out there, forces with power to destroy them, was a terrifying thought. But there was something else in the Vampire King's voice that caught her attention. "What do you mean by prepare?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The Vampire King's lips twitched in a faint, bitter smile. "We will train," he said, his voice hardening. "You may not think you're ready for this, but you're part of this now. The magic that binds us is not something you can run from. You will have to learn how to use it." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Use it?" she repeated. "What are you talking about?" The Vampire King took a step toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. "You are not just some innocent bystander in this, Sarah," he said, his voice low and intense. "You are part of the bloodline that carries the power to either protect or destroy. You have the magic within you, and if you're going to stand a chance against what's coming, you need to learn to control it." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but nothing came out. She had never asked for this, never wanted to be part of a world so filled with magic and danger. But as she looked into the Vampire King's eyes, she knew there was no turning back. She was already tangled in this, whether she liked it or not. "How do I learn?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The Vampire King stepped back, giving her some space, his gaze still focused on her. "I'll teach you," he said, "but it won't be easy. You will need to trust me, Sarah. You will need to embrace what you are, what you can become." He turned away, walking toward the center of the sanctuary. "Come," he said, motioning for her to follow. "I'll show you where we will begin." Sarah hesitated for a moment, her heart racing, but she knew she had no choice. If she wanted to survive this, she had to accept her place in this world, no matter how terrifying it seemed. She followed the Vampire King into the heart of the sanctuary, a space filled with ancient relics and symbols she didn't understand. The air was thick with magic, and Sarah could feel it buzzing around her, making her skin tingle. "This is where it all begins," the Vampire King said, stopping before a large stone pedestal. On it rested a book, its pages worn and yellowed with age. "This is the grimoire of the ancients," he explained, his voice reverent. "It contains all the knowledge of the magic that binds our world. It will show you how to harness the power within you." Sarah stepped forward, her breath catching in her throat. The grimoire looked old, ancient even, and the thought of opening it, of learning the secrets it contained, was both thrilling and terrifying. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice shaking. The Vampire King placed his hand on the book, his fingers tracing the intricate symbols on the cover. "You begin by accepting that you are more than you think," he said. "The magic is already inside you. It has always been inside you. You just need to learn how to control it." Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had no idea what to expect, but she knew this was the path she had to take. If she was going to survive what was coming, she needed to learn. She needed to understand the power she carried within herself. Slowly, cautiously, she placed her hand on the grimoire, feeling the pulse of magic surge through her. It was like nothing she had ever felt before, raw, untamed, and full of potential. She could feel the Vampire King watching her, waiting for her to take the first step. And in that moment, she realized that this was just the beginning of something that would change her life forever. The moment Sarah's fingers made contact with the grimoire, the air around her seemed to tremble. The book hummed with ancient energy, sending ripples of power through her body. She could feel it deep inside her bones, as if the magic inside the book was calling to the magic within her. The Vampire King watched her closely, his amber eyes never leaving her face. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she could feel the magic surging within her, growing stronger with every passing second. She closed her eyes and focused on it, willing herself to understand, to embrace it. The book seemed to open on its own, its pages turning as if it had a life of its own. The words were written in an ancient language she couldn't understand, but as she focused harder, something clicked. The words began to shift in her mind, rearranging themselves into something she could comprehend. "This is the magic that binds us," the Vampire King said, his voice breaking through the haze of energy surrounding her. "This is the knowledge you need to control what is inside you." Sarah's heart raced as the pages of the grimoire continued to turn, the symbols glowing softly as they revealed the secrets of the magic. She could feel the power flowing through her like a river, wild and untamed. She could hear the whispers of the ancient ones, the voices of those who had created this magic long ago. She knew she was standing at the precipice of something dangerous, but she couldn't pull herself away. It was as if the magic had already claimed her, already bound her to it. The Vampire King moved closer, his presence both comforting and terrifying. "Do you feel it?" he asked softly, his voice carrying an edge of both concern and awe. "Do you feel the magic inside you?" Sarah nodded, her eyes still closed as she focused on the power that was now hers to wield. It was overwhelming, but there was something else in it, something she hadn't expected, a deep, primal connection to the Vampire King. She could feel his magic intertwining with hers, like two streams merging into one. The realization hit her like a wave. Her magic and his were bound together, forever. "We are connected," she whispered, her voice shaking with the enormity of it. The Vampire King's gaze softened, but his tone remained serious. "Yes," he said, "our fates are now intertwined. There is no escaping it, Sarah. You are a part of me now, and I am a part of you." Sarah opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. She had known, deep down, that this connection was more than just physical. It was magical, ancient, and irreversible. And as much as she feared it, she knew there was no turning back. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now," the Vampire King said, "you must learn to control this power. It will be the key to protecting us, but it can also be our downfall if you're not careful." Sarah nodded, her mind racing with the weight of his words. She had never asked for this, never wanted to be involved in a world so full of danger and magic. But now, she had no choice. The magic was inside her, and she had to learn to wield it or risk losing everything. The Vampire King led her deeper into the sanctuary, his steps slow and deliberate. "The training will be difficult," he said, his voice low. "But it is necessary. You must learn to harness the magic within you, to control it, or it will control you." Sarah followed him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what this training would entail, but she was ready. She had no other choice. The path ahead of her was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The magic was part of her now, and she had to learn to live with it. They reached a large chamber at the heart of the sanctuary, a room filled with intricate symbols and ancient relics. The air was thick with power, and Sarah could feel the magic swirling around her, pulling at her. The Vampire King motioned for her to stand in the center of the room. "This is where you will begin," he said. "We will start with the basics, the foundation of the magic. You must learn to focus, to control the energy around you, before you can ever hope to wield it." Sarah stepped into the center of the room, her heart racing as she felt the energy in the air. It was overwhelming, but she took a deep breath, trying to center herself. The Vampire King's voice came again, calm and steady. "Close your eyes," he instructed. "Feel the energy around you. Focus on it. Let it flow through you." Sarah did as he said, closing her eyes and focusing on the hum of magic that filled the room. At first, it was chaotic, like a storm raging inside her. But slowly, she began to calm herself, to feel the magic settling within her. It was strange, foreign, but also familiar, like a part of her that had always been there. She reached out with her senses, trying to touch the magic around her, to feel it, to control it. And then, suddenly, she felt it. A spark of power ignited deep within her, and for a moment, everything went still. The magic was hers. She could feel it, like a force running through her veins. She had done it. She had tapped into the power inside her. The Vampire King's voice broke through the silence. "Well done," he said, his voice low but filled with approval. "You've taken the first step. But this is just the beginning. There's much more to learn." Sarah opened her eyes, her heart pounding with excitement and fear. She had done it. She had tapped into the magic inside her. But she knew this was only the start. There was still so much she had to learn, so much she had to control. And as the Vampire King's gaze met hers, she knew one thing for sure. Her life would never be the same again. The days that followed the first lesson in the sanctuary were both overwhelming and intense. Sarah had felt the power inside her that day, a raw and untamed force, but it was only the beginning. Each day, the Vampire King pushed her further, guiding her through exercises that tested her focus, her control, and her will. The magic within her, once chaotic and wild, was slowly beginning to bend to her will, though it remained a constant challenge. The Vampire King watched her closely, offering few words of praise but plenty of corrections when she faltered. She had come to understand that, for him, this was more than training. It was survival. "Focus," he would say, his voice low and steady as they practiced. "The magic responds to your emotions, your thoughts. You must learn to keep them in check, or it will consume you." Sarah could feel the truth of his words. She had made mistakes, more than she cared to admit. One of her first attempts had resulted in a surge of magic so intense that it sent a ripple of energy through the sanctuary, shattering the delicate glass ornaments hanging from the ceiling. It was a stark reminder that the power inside her wasn't something she could control easily. Each time she used the magic, she felt like a tightrope walker, balancing on the edge of a cliff. But despite her fear and doubt, she could also feel the growth inside her. She was learning, and that was all that mattered. One evening, after another exhausting day of practice, Sarah sat alone in the quiet of the sanctuary's common room. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the shadows cast by the flickering light seemed to move on their own. Her mind was tired, and her body ached from the relentless training, but she couldn't stop thinking about what lay ahead. What would it mean to be free from the curse, truly free? What would the world look like after everything they had done? The Vampire King had said that breaking the curse was just the beginning. She knew he was right. The world was changing, and they were in the eye of the storm. She had seen the look in his eyes when he spoke of the dangers ahead. The enemies they faced were not just from the past. There were those in the present who sought to control the magic they had sealed away. Sarah's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to find the Vampire King standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable, as always. "You're quiet tonight," he said, his voice softer than usual. Sarah gave him a weary smile, though it felt more like a grimace. "Just thinking," she replied, "about everything that's happening." The Vampire King nodded and walked toward her, his movements as fluid and graceful as ever. "I understand," he said. "There's much to consider. But you must remember, Sarah, that you are not alone in this. We face these dangers together." Sarah looked up at him, studying his face in the firelight. There was something different in his voice tonight, something that made her wonder if the weight of everything was finally taking its toll on him. He had carried the burden of the curse for so long, and now that it was broken, he still carried the weight of everything that had followed. The world had changed, but he hadn't had time to adjust. "I know," she said softly, meeting his gaze. "But sometimes it feels like we're just fighting against a tide that will never stop." The Vampire King stood silent for a moment, his eyes dark with something deeper than sorrow. Then, slowly he spoke. "When you've lived as long as I have, you learn to accept that some things are beyond your control," he said. "The tide is inevitable, yes, but it's the way we face it that matters. It's the choices we make when the storm is at its worst." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. She could hear the truth in his words, but they also stirred something else within her, something she hadn't fully understood until now. It wasn't just the curse that had held him prisoner all these years. It was the weight of making decisions, of being burdened with the responsibility of controlling the magic, the fate of their world. "You've been carrying this for so long," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you ever going to let it go?" The Vampire King's expression faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly masked it with his usual stoicism. "I let go when I broke the curse," he said, his voice flat. "But the world doesn't allow us to walk away from our responsibilities that easily. We must protect what we've fought for, or it will slip through our fingers." Sarah nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his words. She didn't know if she could ever truly understand the burden he carried, but she was beginning to realize just how much he had given up, just how much they both had to lose. They stood in silence for a long moment, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Then, the Vampire King spoke again, his voice low and steady. "We are both part of something much larger than ourselves now," he said. "And together, we will face whatever comes next." Sarah met his gaze, a sense of resolve settling over her. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing. They would face it together. Whatever storm lay ahead, they would weather it side by side. And in that moment, she realized that this connection, this bond between them, was the one thing she could rely on. The rest of the world might be uncertain, but she wasn't alone in this fight. They had each other, and that was enough for now. The days that followed were filled with intense training and preparation. Sarah's body ached from the constant use of magic, but with each passing day, she grew stronger, more attuned to the power within her. The Vampire King was relentless in his lessons, pushing her to the edge of her limits, testing her resolve. But despite the exhaustion, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose, a growing understanding of the magic that had once felt so foreign to her. The bond between her and the Vampire King had deepened, a connection that neither of them could deny. They were no longer just allies. They were intertwined, their fates sealed by the magic they had unleashed together. And with that connection came something else, a quiet, unspoken understanding. Sarah had begun to see the Vampire King in a new light, his stoic exterior giving way to glimpses of the man beneath. He was more than just a ruler, more than the immortal vampire who had lived through centuries of pain and loss. He was someone who had been shaped by those very things, someone who had sacrificed everything for the sake of the magic that now flowed through them both. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah sat alone in the common room of the sanctuary. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting long shadows on the walls. She had been practicing for hours, trying to master the magic that had once overwhelmed her. Her hands were still shaking from the last attempt, but she knew she was getting closer. The power was hers to command now. She could feel it, burning in her veins. But it was still wild, untamed, and she needed to learn how to focus it, how to make it work for her. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see the Vampire King standing in the doorway, his eyes watching her with the usual intensity. "You're pushing yourself too hard," he said, his voice low but firm. Sarah shook her head, brushing the sweat from her brow. I need to learn, she replied, her voice tight with frustration. I can't afford to fail. The Vampire King stepped into the room, his presence filling the space as he approached her. You are learning, he said, but you cannot force it. The magic responds to your emotions, to your will. It cannot be tamed by anger or fear. Sarah looked up at him, her heart pounding. She knew he was right, but the pressure to master this power, to become the person they needed her to be, was almost too much. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. The Vampire King's gaze softened for a moment, a flicker of something like sympathy in his eyes. Fear is a part of it, he said quietly, but it cannot control you. If you let it, it will destroy you. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had been afraid for so long, afraid of the magic, afraid of the unknown, afraid of what it all meant. But she couldn't afford to let fear rule her. Not now. Not when everything was at stake. I won't let it control me, she said, her voice stronger now. The Vampire King nodded, his expression unreadable once again. Good, he said. Now, let's see what you've learned. He motioned for her to rise, and Sarah obeyed, stepping into the center of the room. The air around them seemed to hum with anticipation, and she could feel the magic swirling just beneath the surface, ready to be harnessed. Focus, the Vampire King said, his voice steady. Feel the magic. Let it flow through you. Command it. Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath, focusing on the power inside her. It was there, pulsing, waiting for her to give it direction. She stretched out her senses, reaching for it, willing it to come to her. Slowly, carefully, she began to shape the magic, guiding it through her body and into the air around her. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was progress. The air in the room began to shift, the temperature dropping as the magic swirled around her. Sarah could feel it, like a living thing, responding to her touch. She held it there, steady, focused, but the strain was starting to show. She could feel the magic pulling at her, pushing her to use it in ways she wasn't sure she could control. Relax, the Vampire King said, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of power she was trying to contain. You're doing well, but you must stay in control. The magic is not your enemy, but it will not be tamed if you fight it. Sarah took another deep breath, her muscles tense, her heart racing. She could do this. She had to. Slowly, she loosened her grip on the magic, allowing it to flow more freely through her. The energy in the room shifted again, and this time, it felt right. It felt like it was hers, a part of her. She opened her eyes, and for the first time, she felt a sense of connection, not just to the magic, but to the world around her. The Vampire King stood watching her, his expression inscrutable, but Sarah could see the faintest glimmer of approval in his eyes. Well done, he said, his voice soft but sincere. You've made progress. Sarah smiled, the exhaustion of the training session lifting from her shoulders. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The Vampire King stepped closer, his eyes still on her. This is only the beginning, he said. You've learned to control the magic, but now you must learn how to use it, to protect what you hold dear, to fight for what matters. Sarah nodded, her resolve hardening. She had come this far, and she wouldn't stop now. The journey ahead would be difficult, but she was ready to face whatever came next. Together, they would fight. Together, they would survive. The air in the sanctuary felt different now, charged with the weight of everything they had been through. Sarah stood at the edge of the grand hall, her eyes fixed on the Vampire King as he stood in the center of the room, his back straight, his posture that of a ruler, but with something softer in his eyes. The last few weeks had been filled with intense training, endless lessons, and preparation for the battle that was looming. She had learned to control the magic inside her, to wield it, and to understand the weight of the responsibility it carried. But now, everything had led to this moment. The final battle was approaching. The enemies they had been preparing for were close, too close. They knew that they couldn't afford any more delays, and neither could Sarah. She had grown stronger in ways she hadn't thought possible, but with each passing day, the fear of what was to come weighed heavier on her heart. She was ready, but was she truly prepared for the cost? She glanced at the Vampire King, her thoughts racing. He had trained her, protected her, and, despite the tension that always lingered between them, she had come to trust him. There was a bond between them now, More than magic, more than fate. Something deeper. Something that tied them together, whether they liked it or not. The Vampire King turned, sensing her gaze. His amber eyes met hers, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift from his shoulders. He nodded, his lips curling into the faintest of smiles. "You're ready," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her breath caught in her throat. "Are you?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The Vampire King's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet determination. "I have been ready for centuries," he said, his voice low, his gaze unwavering. "But it doesn't matter. This fight, this battle, is ours to win. Together." The words hung in the air between them, and Sarah felt a surge of something she couldn't name, rise inside her. It was fear, yes, but it was also strength. Determination. She wasn't alone in this anymore. She had a place in this world, a role to play, and she would fight for it. She would fight for him, for them. The Vampire King's expression softened just slightly, and for the briefest of moments, Sarah saw the man beneath the centuries of power and pain. He wasn't just the Vampire King anymore. He was someone who had fought for freedom, for redemption. And in that moment, Sarah knew that she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for both of them, for a future neither of them had ever thought possible. "We fight together," she said, her voice strong and filled with resolve. The Vampire King's gaze never left hers, and something in his eyes shifted, something that told her he believed her. He stepped toward her, offering his hand. "Then let us begin," he said, his voice resolute. Without hesitation, Sarah took his hand. She had made her choice. There was no turning back. The enemies that had pursued them, that had sought to control the magic they had sealed away, were closing in. But Sarah knew one thing for sure. She wouldn't face this alone. With the Vampire King at her side, they would face whatever came next. And whatever it took, they would win. Together. The doors of the sanctuary creaked open, and they stepped into the unknown, ready for the battle that awaited them. The world beyond was filled with uncertainty, but Sarah's heart no longer beat with fear. It beat with purpose. And as she stood beside the Vampire King, she knew that the road ahead would be long, dangerous, and fraught with challenges. But it would also be theirs to walk together. And that was all that mattered. They had fought to get this far, and now they would fight to the end. With the magic between them and the bond that had been forged in the fire of battle, there was no force in the world that could break them apart. Together, they would face the darkness, and together, they would emerge victorious. The future was uncertain, but with each other, they would shape it. Their journey was just beginning, and Sarah was ready to walk the path ahead, no matter what it might bring. Because now, more than ever, she knew that she was not alone.